Immanuel Kant, Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals. So we now turn to further examination of what would constitute the basic principle or grounding principle of morality. And here some further distinctions and analyses have to be made. So the first thing we ask is, well, looking at morality, is it an a priori or a posteriori basis? So we already saw that an a posteriori basis would mean that something like a proposition where you have to appeal to experience in order to sort of verify it or justify it. The problem with this is if morality were derived on such a basis through experience, it seems like we wouldn't be able to determine really what's right, especially for all circumstances. Why? Because circumstances are different when it comes to right and wrong, as Aristotle saw. And because of that, well, you could say, well, let's say if I kill a person in this circumstance, it seems wrong, but if I kill a person in another circumstance, it seems okay, for example, defense, so there's no right and wrong based upon my experience. You see, so that's a problem. So because of this, Kant says, well, morality has to have another basis. It can't be an experience, so it has to be a priori. And how is it a priori, though? Kant suggests that it's a priori because the moral law arises from within us, and in particular issues forth from the will. Now, this is all well and done, but the problem is that if it issues from us individually, then it seems to be very much relative to us. So how do we escape relativism, the sense that morality is just relative to your belief and my belief about what's right and wrong? So because of that, Kant says, well, arising from us, morality also has to have an objective or non-subjective aspect to it. And because in this way, Kant ties morality to reason itself. So we're not just willing agents, we're also rational agents. And tying it to reason in this way, we find that, well, these subjective rules that we might otherwise have, having a moral law that arises within us, can then be tied to the command of reason. And so this kind of changes the idea here, because once it's tied to reason, we can tie morality to what's called a universal, something that holds for all cases. For example, when I say that Socrates is a human being, that holds for one case, right? But when I say that all persons are mortal, right, and because they're human, well, that holds for all cases. And in the same way, when I say that lying is wrong, the idea is we want it to hold not just for this specific subjective case, but for all cases. Okay, so what Kant then wants to do is, what he shows here is that morality is a priori because it arises within us, so it's not something that we obtain from experience, and it's also just not subjective or relative because it's tied to human reason, which is tied to the idea of all cases in the universal. Now, moving forward, he analyzes types of moral commands. So remember, we're dealing with Deontology, which is about the issue of morality being tied to certain duties or commands. He suggests that there are two types of commands. First, the hypothetical. Second, the categorical. Now, only one of these will properly apply to the right description of moral action and the moral law. The first are hypothetical imperatives, which we define as a command that results from the necessity adhering to action. So these types of imperatives are similar to the counsels we saw. There's certain types of rules that we give to ourselves, receive from others. They have an if-then structure. For example, if I want to get an A in this class, then I ought to study and work hard. You see that? That's a hypothetical. Notice the imperative there is the ought to study. That's the command. I ought to. You ought to study. And notice it's just not like you ought to study for all cases. It's you ought to study if you want to get an A, right? So he further distinguishes two types of hypothetical imperatives. One, there's the rules of skill, which are commands tied to certain objectives that we seek, especially skills. For example, if I want to learn Greek, then I ought to. There's the command to learn the alphabet. And then there's counsels of prudence, kind of like this one, tied to the practical dictates of action or life. If I want to maintain friendships, then I ought not to betray my friend's secrets. Now notice that these hypothetical imperatives, they can be sort of tied to moral issues, but they're not directly tied because, it's not always the case that I ought to study or betraying someone's secrets might sometimes be necessary, especially if that secret is, for example, that someone raped someone or murdered someone, then you should betray the secret. So from that perspective, these types of imperatives are only indirectly related to morality because the commands don't hold for all cases. So we then turn to the famous categorical imperative of Kant, and these are commands which result from some course of action that is deemed necessary in and of itself. So we have our typical examples: don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal. And notice that these particular commands are not saying, if you want this, then you shouldn't lie. If you want to do that, then you shouldn't cheat. No, they're saying don't. So they're not hypotheticals. They're saying this should not be done for all cases. So from that perspective, we distinguish these types of imperatives from the hypothetical because we feel duty bound to adhere to them in and of themselves for the sake of themselves. From this, Kant formulates what's called the categorical imperative, which is this imperative that holds in terms of moral action. And he says, act only on that maxim whereby thou canst at the same time will that it should become a universal law. So what Kant is saying here is that you should only act morally, in terms of right and wrong action, when you see that, what you're doing would hold for all cases and there's really no exceptions to the rule. So you can ask yourself, is it ever right to murder an innocent person? And at some level you have to say, well, it's never right to murder an innocent person. So that being the case, not murdering an innocent person would fall within the categorical imperative. So such a command, as is evident, holds absolutely for all cases of moral action. And for Kant, this serves as the basic foundation or grounding principle of all morality. So to determine if an action falls within this scope, we need to see if it applies for all cases, as I've said. And to give you another example, is it ever right to rape another person? I think if we examine this particular statement, this question, we see that there is never a case in which it could be right to rape another person. And so this would fall within the categorical imperative that one ought never to rape another. You see that? And so this is where Kant is going to these types of universal statements, and these types of other statements here would, according to Kant, to some extent fall within the scope of the categorical imperative. So autonomy and self-determination. So what happens is, from the categorical imperative and also looking at the nature of human beings as rational agents who give themselves the law, the moral law, he starts to deduce some interesting consequences which are very famous here. So we see first of all that the categorical imperative follows from the will. And so from that perspective, we give ourselves the moral law. So there's a certain sense of freedom there because we're not being bound by the rule of another. And remember, Kant's coming into the Enlightenment age out of the rules of kind of the old regimes of monarchies and aristocracies and separations between lords and servants, etc. And from that perspective, the idea of autonomy or freedom or self-rule is very important. So it literally means autos is self, and nomos means self-rule, so it's self-rule. So the idea is similar to democracy. It's a sense of rule by the people. So it's the idea that giving ourselves the moral law, because it comes from our own will and the will to do right, the idea is that we bound by a rule that we ourselves are given. That's a sense of freedom. So we do not individually create the moral law, and the reason for this is that those laws are tied to reason, which is universal, which everyone has access to. And so even as we give ourselves the moral law, we are nonetheless bound by something that is in some sense over and above us. So we also have self-determination. So insofar as we give ourselves the moral law, we also have to decide whether or not to follow it. And this gives the freedom to choose and to self-determine our moral character. So some more consequences that he derives from this. So he distinguishes a means to an end from an end in itself. Now, a means to an end would be an instrumental object, or something that I use as an instrument. For example, a hammer that I use would be a means to nail in a screw, which is the end to put up a board, say. And this we distinguish from an end in itself, which would be a non-instrumental object. For example, if I force a person and I notice there an end because you can't use a person as a means to do what I want. So in other words, your own end. So there's something wrong there. And indeed, Kant is going to say that human beings are ends in themselves. Okay, we can't really force a person to do this. They're rational agents, and as rational agents, we ought to treat them as ends and never as instruments. Okay, so for example, selling a person for profit would be treating a person as a hammer of sorts, and we ought never to do that for any case. And so here's an interesting consequence, but not only are other persons ends in themselves as rational agents, but so are we insofar as we are each rational agents, and therefore we can't treat ourselves even as means because we're ends. And so I can't sell myself into slavery, and there are other consequences of this particular aspect which you can discuss within our discussions. So a further consequence is what he calls the kingdom of ends. All rational beings are ends in themselves. So all together we participate in a moral kingdom of ends. So here's the idea that basically it's kind of shared governance, right? Kind of like a democracy. And it's a little different in the sense that, well, we're all members, right? Because we're ruled by the moral law, just as we're members of the United States, the democracy. But we are also sovereigns. Why? Because we give ourselves from the will, the moral law. So again, it is kind of like a democracy, a little bit different because we're not all kind of, I guess we are kind of all giving the law in one sense. So in that sense, we are kind of members and sovereigns, and we're bound together in this great kingdom of ends. Now notice here that disregarding the moral law is first of all to disregard oneself because you give yourself the law, and it's to disregard others because we are all bound together by the law in a kingdom of ends. There is then dignity, obedience, and holiness. Now notice, as an end in itself, a person has no cash value. You can't sell a person. A person has no price. And what does this mean? As rational agents, we therefore have intrinsic worth. In other words, intrinsic worth means what's the value of a person? You could say infinite. There's absolutely no value you can place. So that's intrinsic worth. We also have dignity. In other words, each person deserves absolute respect. For example, if you have a prisoner, whether a criminal or a prisoner of war, you don't have the right to torture that person. Because no matter what that person has done, as an end in themselves, they have respect, and they ought to be respected, although they should be locked up in the sense in which they've done something wrong. Now, finally, insofar as one's maxims are all in accord with the moral law, in other words, I do what is right, I don't kill, I believe that it's not right to kill, I believe that it's not right to steal or lie, etc., and one lives by those maxims, Kant says this person is holy. So it's a kind of, you could see it not as a religious holiness, but as a kind of civil holiness, a civil holiness that is in accord with the moral law that we give ourselves as rational agents. So let's get back to that question, well, how is the categorical imperative possible? Which means, well, what type of proposition are we talking about when we talk about the categorical imperative, which we saw before, which basically we should act so as to make the whatever maxim we use universally applicable. Kant will answer by making a final distinction. And he adds to the a priori, a posteriori, a distinction between analytic and synthetic propositions. So a proposition is analytic insofar as its predicate concept P is contained in the subject concept. So for example, if I say all bachelors are unmarried men, well, this is obviously the case because by a bachelor I just mean an unmarried man. So this would be called an analytic concept because, well, the proposition is not really adding to anything that we know about what a bachelor already is, and in fact, defining a bachelor is just an unmarried man. In contradistinction, a synthetic proposition is a proposition whose predicate concept is not contained in the subject concept. For example, if I say that all happy men are married men, well, this isn't necessarily the case because there's lots of happy men who may not be married. So in order to know this, you would have to have some sort of knowledge that you gain in terms of understanding what happy persons are and what married persons are, and then you'd have to see if that corresponds. So in this case it doesn't, so it would be false. Okay, looking then to the distinctions, he adds these all together and he gets four types of propositions. And the first is an analytic proposition, which is a priori, and the example is all unmarried men are bachelors. Which is the reverse of the other, but still it's saying the same thing here. So the idea is that it's analytic a priori because we're not appealing to experience, and it's analytic because, well, the one concept is contained in the other. Another one, analytic a posteriori, well, these propositions Kant says are simply impossible. And why? Because, well, you can't have a proposition in which the subject and the predicate concept basically mean the same thing, and that you learn this from experience. I won't go into this any more deeply than I have here. The issue basically moves into deeper questions of epistemology and metaphysics, so we'll leave it at that. The next is a synthetic a posteriori proposition. And here the example is the chair is red. Well, how do you know that? Well, I can only know that it's red by experience, and notice that chair and red are not the same concepts because, well, my table can be red, but table is not chair, so it must be synthetic. And finally, here's a little bit of a contentious example that Kant uses, but I'll show you why this is the case. A synthetic a priori proposition. So again, I ask, how do you know that 2 plus 3 is 5? I can't give you any example that, in other words, show you why that's the case. You can only know it kind of inwardly, intuitively. It's synthetic, though, and why is that the case? Because even if 2 plus 3 refers to 5 and 5 to 5, the fact is that you're adding something to your knowledge by recognizing that 2 plus 3 is 5. Why? Because 1 plus 4 is also 5, and also we have this particular number is 5, and any number of infinite variations could be that. And so what's happening is that this somehow adds to our knowledge of what 5 is and what can make 5, and really for this reason we have mathematics as a science. Okay, so we have a synthetic a priori proposition, which is a very interesting type of proposition. Now, Kant will conclude that, like this last proposition, the categorical imperative is a synthetic a priori proposition. So consider the maxim, lying is wrong. Well, obviously wrong and lying are not the same concept, right? Because, well, stealing is also wrong, but stealing is not the same as lying, so it's synthetic. So, but is it a priori or a posteriori? That's difficult to say. If somebody steals something, for example, they go in a store and they take a watch without paying, where do you see the wrong? Because somebody, maybe, for example, the person who owned the store said, yes, you can come back tomorrow and take the watch, who purchased it, and they said that they didn't want to pick it up until tomorrow. So they come in and they take the watch, and you see them take it, and they walk out, and they don't pay. Or at least it seems that way. So the wrongness of the action is not something that you perceive. It's not something you see. Rather, it's something that you seem to know. Okay, so if somebody actually steals, well, you know it's wrong, and it's not because you see it, but because you know it. And so it's like 2 plus 3 is 5. You know that 2 plus 3 is 5, not because, I show you some sticks and put them together and show you that these 3 sticks add up to, and 2 sticks add up to 5 sticks, but rather, I could put anything else together, like 5 mugs and 5 watches, for example. I just know what 5 is, and I know what these combinations create. And so just like that, I know that lying is wrong somehow from within, and of course Kant says, well, this makes sense. It's a priori because it arises from within us. And so this then becomes the solution to Kant's question. What is the foundation or the principle or the groundwork of morals? It's the categorical imperative. And what type of a proposition is it based upon? A synthetic a priori proposition. It's a proposition that arises from within us, so it's a priori, and it's a proposition that holds universally for all cases and synthesizes the various experiences, the various, ideas that we have about right and wrong and all the instances that would fall in between.